Jurassic World producer Frank Marshall recently made the following comments about the upcoming Fallen Kingdom movie. I think since Jurassic Park we've got more animatronics than any of the other movies, except Jurassic Park. The quote and the hyped up reaction it got kind of irked me because it's simply a businessman with a vested interest promoting his product and there's no reason why his claims should hold any merit, which I made a video on a couple of days ago. But there's also something else about this that got me thinking, something related more to audiences and critics' reaction to blockbusters in general than anything specific to Jurassic World. Let's say the producer is telling the truth and there are more animatronics in Jurassic World 2 than in any of the other movies in the franchise bar the original. Forget the quality of the animatronics, how good they look, how well they move, how real they look. Let's just forget about that for a second and agree there will be more. Well, so what? So what if there are more animatronics than in previous films? In what way is this something that is praiseworthy? Because this quote is receiving praise online. And why is the producer himself tapping himself on the back here? The fact that they've used animatronics is not worthy of any notice. What matters is how good it looks in the film. Heck, the animatronics could be terrible just like the Apatosaurus in the previous film. I mentioned in a previous video how this quote was obviously a producer's way of building hype and putting bombs in seats. I'm more concerned here with after those bombs have left the seats. The Hollywood people say things like this, of course, intentionally to generate income. But I think that today movie audiences and critics tend to praise and overpraise movies for doing things that movies have been doing for yonks. Frank Marshall believes that saying Fallen Kingdom will have lots of practical effects is worth shouting about. Colin Trevorrow seems to think that telling people his Jurassic World will be shot on film and not digitally is worth mentioning, which is why in the past he mentioned it. Well, guess what guys, another film has done both of these things and it was called Jurassic Park. And it is an all-time classic, but the fact that it had animatronics and was shot on film were not the only reasons, not even anywhere near the primary reasons. They were just one of the few elements that definitely added to the film, but how about the script, the acting, the pacing, the tension, and having one of the most talented directors around in his prime, building a visual rollercoaster ride for the audience. But I guarantee that when Fallen Kingdom does come out, if it does have a lot of practical effects, people will point their fingers to the practical effects and say, yes, that's why I love Fallen Kingdom, because it had practical effects. Well, did you also like Troll 2 and Howard the Duck, because those films also had practical effects? Look, I know the argument is much more complicated than that, and more than anything you have to look at how good the effects on screen are, regardless of whether they are practical or CGI. After all, isn't the best CGI when you don't notice it's CGI? How the effects were applied should have no weight over your opinion of a film. How well they are applied should. Even as a massive advocate of practical effects, I can't help rolling my eyes when a film sells itself on having practical effects, or more importantly to me because the audience's opinion means pretty much everything, when a film is given a pass because it has practical effects. Take The Void for example, a film with a messy plot and odd ending. It wasn't particularly memorable and pretty silly, but look at the reaction online and you'll see that many were quick to praise the film and overlook its faults because it had practical effects, even though the practical effects weren't all that great. They aren't doing anything new with practical effects, they haven't created some new form of technology, they've just been doing what filmmakers have been doing since A Trip to the Moon and earlier, and yet certain films are getting a pass because they simply have practical effects. Look at James Cameron's Avatar, it's often accused of being a pretty Dances with Wolves ripoff, with backlash being amplified by the fact that all of the effects are digital and haven't aged too well. Well, if anything, we should be praising the effects in that film because Cameron did create new technology and in doing so propelled movie making tools into further advancement. I think within the past few years I'm starting to see loads of films that get praised for things that filmmakers were doing anyway since films were made. When a building was made to explode in Lethal Weapon 3, did everyone go on about how that was a real explosion and how brilliant it was? Not really, no. But so much was made about the explosion at the end of Spectre being real and not CGI. The cast of Alien Covenant during shooting were chased by real men in alien suits, as they constantly told us before the film came out. Well, so what? So were the original cast 40 years ago in the first film. Mad Max Fury Road is an interesting one. It is constantly praised for its car chase scenes which were all practical effects and had no CGI. That's not true by the way, it actually had a lot of CGI. but it was so good most people didn't notice it. Anyway, much of the praise was because the car chases were practical, when in fact the praise should have been because the chases were exhilarating, engaging and adrenaline rushing. I wonder if the original Mad Max movies were presented with this much praise just for having practical effects. Of course not, because back then there was practically no alternative. But my point is, today you see loads and loads of praise heaped on a film just because it did something for real. Filmmakers know this and go out of their way to say during marketing that their film has practical effects. Like having animatronics is some kind of sympathy token, a get out of jail card. It's the same with, say, a filmmaker, a critic or audience members talking up a movie not using CGI blood and opting for squibs, or choosing not to use shaky cam. It's great and I'm a big fan of when it's done, but why the extra praise when people have been working this way for years? All that effort that went into practical effects, unpraised even in your standard 80s action movie or crappy B-movie horror flick, because that was the standard of filmmaking back then. Back in the old days, practical effects were the norm because they were the only option. When films like Star Wars came along and eventually Jurassic Park and Terminator 2, people were wowed by CGI. And though today it has a lot to do with CG not being used properly, it seems people have become tired of CGI, but also because it's become a norm of blockbusters. And when a film chooses to use practical effects, which is now not the norm, it gets showered and showered with praise. It's not just the effects either. Look at the recent Black Panther film. Was it praised for being a really good superhero movie? Whether it was or wasn't a good one I can't say because I haven't seen it. But looking at critical and audience reception, not really. Most of the praise was at how progressive it was, since it was one of the first major blockbusters to have black people in main roles. That was the main marketing gimmick of the film, as if Hollywood attempted to pretend they weren't making a movie aimed to make millions of dollars and were instead performing a public service. But again, the film gained almost unanimous praise for its cast being black and not the quality of the film itself. And excuse me, what about Blade? What about Candyman? What about Hancock, Spawn, Coming to America, Bad Boys, and the other countless films that had black people in major roles, and interestingly did not sell themselves or were praised solely because of the fact that they had black people? Gender equality is another one. Some filmmakers get so caught up in the idea of strong, independent woman that they forget they are making a movie and not an advertisement for feminism, and have sometimes derailed their films in doing so. Star Wars The Force Awakens, for example, had a character that could practically do anything, and it was very difficult to relate to this character or see that she had any kind of arc. But there was very little discussion or talk on this. Most of the talk in regards to that character was the fact that, hey, Star Wars for once has a female main character. How progressive we are. Anyway, feminism in movies is an argument for another day, but when a modern movie like Wonder Woman or The Hunger Games gets praised for having strong women characters, which happens so much even in poor movies, which leads me to think that some people are too afraid of calling a decent movie decent or a mediocre movie mediocre, and have to overpraise in fear of being called a misogynist. It's as if Sarah Connor, Nurse Ratched, Ellen Ripley, the bride from Kill Bill, Leah Organa, Clarice Starling, Dorothy Gale, and Phyllis Dietrichson never existed. These new movies aren't doing anything new by parading the phrase strong independent woman in their PR interviews. Strong independent women have always existed in film. It's like some films have this cover, this impenetrable backup, this safety net, which means you aren't socially allowed to criticize a film based on its quality because of the fact that the film has some kind of progressive message. I'll tell you what I think is one of the worst offenders, The Artist. This was a pretty good movie. I enjoyed it. It was funny and whimsical, and yes, the black and white added a vintage touch. But critics at the time were going crazy over the fact that it was a black and white film and a silent film in the modern age, and how that made the film nostalgic and memories and yada yada yada. The fact is, why should it have gotten extra praise because it was silent? If you lifted this film and placed it into the era of silent movies like Metropolis and City Lights, would The Artist stand out much? I really don't think so. Yes, they recreated the look of a silent film, but as a movie it wasn't a lot better than your standard decent black and white film. Being silent worked for the film's story, so I won't call it a gimmick, but it definitely was an aspect of the movie that gave it more praise than it deserved, even landing it Best Picture. And I will say The Artist was an okay film, but I will also say The Artist won Best Picture because it was a silent film, which in the eyes of critics and audiences made it quirky and new. But silent pictures are not new, and practical effects are not new, and neither are the inclusion of black people and strong women in movies. So I think audiences and critics need to take a step back sometimes when movies have these things and judge the films for their quality and quality alone.